Hi, I'm Patrick Sullivan. This is Recurring Insight, and for this episode, I'm going to be talking about Black Vice. So Black Vice is a cool design in part because there's just a lot of history to it. If you were around in Magic's early days, it was just a constant feature of both casual and competitive play. But just from sort of a bigger design perspective, it sort of elucidates the idea of splash damage. There's some cards that can have good intents and go after the right people, but can be so powerful or so broad that it ends up damaging the experience or win rate of people that the card's not really intended to go after.
In spite of it not really being a feature of competitive Magic anymore, and not being the most commander appropriate card, Black Vice has a rich history to it. It appeared as an uncommon, and the rate on the card was such that aggressive decks just played it early on in Magic's history, and it was a readily available card too. Now, there's definitely some combos that you can do with it. The most common one was to play with all the really good sinkholes and stone rains to try to prevent your opponent from ever getting cards out of their hand. You could even set up a couple of combo applications with cards like Wheel of Fortune and Time Twister, but the card was kind of just playable at a baseline relative to other options that were available at the time. And there's some good stuff going on here. One, the card is really, really swingy and dramatic. When it gets played, the opponent is under a burden to get their hand empty as quick as possible. It makes your opponent having instants a potentially powerful thing because it mucks up the math. That's all good stuff. Another thing that's ostensibly positive about Black Vice is that it's really powerful against opponents who are not doing anything. And generally, it's good to be moving the game towards both players taking actions, playing cards, and sort of hashing it out on the battlefield. And because of that, it makes sense to make a couple powerful cards that punish people who are not doing that. And Black Vice was and still could be successful in that sort of role. But it does introduce the concept of splash damage. Sometimes you make a card for a particular role, and it fulfills that role, but it is so powerful that it ends up fulfilling a bunch of other roles and victimizes people who weren't intended to be victimized from it. I think you could make a case maybe that Veil of Summer qualifies. I think that Strip Mine was an early example of this too. I heard that the design team made it as a response to Library of Alexandria. Library of Alexandria at the time, extremely powerful. Not the worst idea to make an answer to it, but Strip Mine happens to be good against that and all other lands. So it's not exactly a surgical instrument against Library of Alexandria. The splash damage there is enormous. Wizards has made better stabs at it in the future, and I'd like to call out Ebony Eye Natsuki as a good example of this. It's not a perfect design because you don't get the opportunity to deal small bits of damage. The incentive just becomes to do nothing but Stone Rain and boomerang your opponent's lands, and that play pattern isn't very much fun. But there are a couple positives shown off in the design here, some lessons learned from Black Vice. The first one, 2 mana instead of 1 mana, is such a huge difference for how stressful it is. You're on the draw, your opponent plays a Black Vice, and the game's already extremely stressful. The difference between 1 and 2 mana is huge there. Black Vice is good even against beatdown decks if it is in your opening hand. The Natsuki really demands that your opponents be up to nothing or you're really comboing out to make the card really do very much. So Black Vice is kind of an interesting one to look back at because for as unfun as it is perceived, and there is some truth to that. I mean, it's an extremely stressful card, and the times where it's powerful, the game's not very much fun. There is some good going on here, and I do believe that this is design space that Magic could tap into in the future. I don't like the comparative hand size thing very much, but I think explicitly calling out your opponent is not taking game actions, they're not casting spells, they're not playing cards out of their hand, is a fine thing to punish at a particular rate. But Black Vice, I think, is really instructive in the fact that those responses need to be really precise. They need to be really surgical and not so good on rate or in the opening hand that it sort of ends up being a common feature of games and good against opponents it's not really meant to target.
So again, that was Black Vice, and this is Recurring Insight. A few things to do from here. Make sure you're subscribed to the Starseed Games YouTube page so you can get notified when new content gets uploaded. Throw a like and a comment up there as well. And what else is there? I'm trying to even think. Go through the same clip every single time. Oh yeah, sure. The Receivables podcast. Make sure you're checking that out as well. Cedric and I are having a really good time with it, and if you were, a grinder in the early aughts, might be right up your alley.